When it comes to making high-quality beer, there are a few factors often focused on, one being fermentation temperature, which is widely believed to be especially important when it comes to lager styles. Another factor is yeast pitch rate, which again is generally viewed as being more crucial in cool fermented lagers. This is the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and this week I'm joined by contributor Jordan Folks to discuss the interplay of fermentation temperature and yeast pitch rate when making lager, particularly Munich Helles.
Historically, it seems that lagers have been perceived as just too darn hard for a new homebrewer to make, and there are probably even some lifelong homebrewers that have never tried one because what you've just described is kind of intimidating. And in the modern world of homebrewing, we've certainly hacked together a lot of equipment and ingredients that can help us achieve that, but I can still understand the intimidation. And so maybe in today's episode, we can kind of break down what it really is, and maybe it's not as hard as some people might think.
Absolutely. And over the last, 6-7 years, I've noticed more and more homebrewers, as I'm sure you have as well, dipping their toes into lager brewing, and a lot of them are breaking the rules. I put air quotes around that, and they're happy with the outcome. As we do every other week on this show, we will be going over an experiment that we performed on this topic. But unlike many of our other experiments where the variable is pretty cut and dry, this one might seem a little bit convoluted to some listeners. So we are going to do our best to make it as easy to understand as possible. We want more people making lagers, however you want to do it. And you're going to see, as you probably already know, that we have our differences of opinions on this as well. So, all right, if you're a fan of this show and you would like to receive a reward for helping us to keep it going, please consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy over at patreon.com/Brülosophy, where you make a small monthly pledge and you receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique perks from YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to either a monthly live brew day with a Brülosophy contributor or somebody in the brewing world. Learn more about all of the rewards we offer for your support over at patreon.com/Brülosophy. Also, if you wouldn't mind leaving a rating and review of our show in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd appreciate that too, as it makes it easier for people who haven't heard of us yet to find the show. And we want to thank everybody who's already taken the time to do that. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches, as well as their 240-volt 10-gallon setup. Both are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really puts the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they are intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. Well, if you're not ready to make the jump to electric just yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag homebrewing starter kits. Whatever it is you're looking for, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. Listener Jeff Shank wrote in with an interesting question I'm sure others have wondered about as well. Jeff said, with this long, miserable winter in the mountains of western Pennsylvania, I want to brew a batch, but can't be outside. I wanted to do a 5-gallon, that's 19 liters, stovetop batch by boiling 2 to 3 gallons, then topping up with distilled water in the fermenter. Should I add the full volume of additions to the smaller boil volume, knowing it will eventually be topped up to 5 gallons? Or would it be better to separate the additions? It feels like I should be able to add it all to the smaller volume of water without worrying about hyperconcentration, but I'm not sure if I'm missing out on something or just wrong in my thinking. Is topping up with water or something that you've done, Jordan?
Not in 10, 15 years.
Would you agree that this is basically referring to a partial boil, right?
Right. That was really popular 15 years ago when extract was more popular and all grain was something that was seen as a bit more advanced and it wasn't as commonplace. And so, yeah, we would do these partial mash, partial boil, partial volume batches where you used extract like powder or liquid and then steeped some character grains in like a mesh sack. And then you either chilled or even hot, poured that into your fermenter, and then just topped up with water the rest of the way. So the former that our listeners suggested is the way to go. You want to do all of your ingredients in that concentrated batch, and then you'll top up with water. But you just have to account for, obviously, the gravity change, but also the bitterness and hopping change. So just keep that in mind, that when you're watering it down, you're watering down the bitterness as well. So you need to make kind of a more bitter brew to begin with, so that you have a balanced result after topping off.
Yeah, you pretty much took the words out of my mouth. This is something, when I first started brewing, like you, Jordan, I was doing extract with steeping grains. Every of the 12 batches that I brewed using that method, all of them were topped up. And I feel like I just was talking about this on the show. My approach was to even more quickly chill that wort. I would pour a 20-pound bag of ice into my fermentation bucket and then pour the hot concentrated wort over that. It was almost always just enough to get me to right around 5 gallons. I wasn't terribly worried about a couple of points OG either in either direction. And that 20-pound bag just did the trick, and I could immediately pitch my yeast. So I didn't have to, wait for the chilling and the potential contamination that could happen with that. Do the whole, just brew. My suggestion, I feel like we're saying the same thing here, Jordan, is brew your batch the same exact way you would if you were doing a full volume boil, just with less water. That's it. And then I wouldn't, again, what I would do is make a batch, determine how the bitterness came out based on my recipe, and then adjust from there. It might be that I would think at least that your IBU is going to be right around the same regardless. If you're putting, let's say, 25 grams of Magnum in at 60 minutes in a 9-gallon batch of wort versus a 4.5-gallon batch of wort, you're still going to get a lot of, it's good that concentrated wort ostensibly will be more bitter. So again, mess around with it. You'll come to your own conclusions on what works best, but absolutely a method. And I have done it all grain as well. I think I've done it twice, but it worked perfectly fine. And dilution is something that I feel like we could make a lot of people's brew days way easier, and they just don't consider it. So good question. Hopefully we answered your question, Jeff. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brulosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Be sure to pick up some rad Brülosophy merch, which you can do by visiting brulosophy.com/shop. We're offering more options now than we ever have before, from t-shirts, hoodies, and hats to fanny packs, shorts, coffee mugs, tank tops, mobile phone cases, stickers, and so many other things. We've done our best to keep prices reasonable, and international shipping is now available. Again, you can head to brulosophy.com/shop, click one of the product images on that page, which will redirect you to our Dashery store, or you can just go directly there at brulosophy.dashery.com. We've also put a link in the description of this episode. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. I love lager styles, and I'm really happy to see that I'm not alone in that love. I mean, it used to be that you would go to a brew pub and the only options were whatever was popular in terms of ales at the time. But nowadays, I almost expect there to be a few lager options on tap, which is amazing. My wife and I just went to Kronwolf last night, and I had 2 lagers while I was there, among some IPA and some other stuff that they have on tap. But it's just so rad to see that more and more places are offering these crisp, drinkable lagers. Still, the process for making them, at least from a traditional perspective, is a little bit more convoluted than what it takes to make the typical ale, or at the very least, it requires a bit more patience, which we know not every brewer has. The reason for this can be mostly chalked up to the main thing lagers are known for, which is cool fermentation. We're going to get to that in a minute, but let's start with a little bit of history first.
So lagers are really old. There are historical records that indicate that lagers were being brewed in Bavaria as far back as the 14th century. And so, these beers were typically brewed in the winter because they could store them in cold caves for extended periods of time. And that's actually where this term lager comes from, the German word lagern, which means to store. So, the way that these would work is that they eventually figured out that, man, these beers that we're brewing in the summer are kind of disgusting. And so that's where this kind of old school, they were spoiling basically, right? And as we know now, cold temperatures can suppress lactobacillus and other spoilage organisms. And so not to mention, as they've, kind of accidentally started brewing with what ended up being lager yeast, it turns out they worked better in the cold and probably due to some natural selection there. So they eventually actually started, prohibiting brewing in the summer. And so they would brew in the winter and then just store them in these caves. And henceforth, the lager was kind of born.
Yeah, I feel like we've talked about this a few times in the past, but there's this, it's easy at least to, I guess believe that when we're thinking about lagers and particularly the yeast used traditionally to ferment these lager styles, that these people hand selected this yeast, in the 14th century and just somehow knew, even though science wasn't up to date back then, that cooler fermentation temperatures were going to work with this specific, Sac Pastorianus. And that's just not how it worked. What it was these people who had honestly no idea about microbiology, were making their beers, and whatever happened. And it just so happened to be that as they were experimenting with these different temperatures, those conditions favored Sac Pastorianus over Cerevisiae. And that created what we now know today as lager yeast, which is a hybrid. We know that Sac Pastorianus, I believe all strains of it are a hybrid between Cerevisiae and Eubianus, right?
I don't know about all, but I do know that there was actually even a recent article that I read about trying to trace where the heck did this come from? Because remember a few years ago, they're like, we found it. It's from like the Amazon rainforest or something. Or
Patagonia,
like that.
I think is what
Yeah, exactly. And then now they're going, oh, okay, actually we are finding it in Europe too. Just somehow these, strains hybridized and created a resulting yeast strain that just works well at cold temps.
If there isn't a more beautiful representation of evolution, you know what I mean? The fact that these single-celled organisms were able to mutate to create what we know, and who knows, if it was some other organism that got in there in the hundreds and hundreds of years ago, we might still appreciate what could ultimately be a very different beer, but we've got what we've got today because of that. I think it's awesome. All right, let's move on to fermentation temperature. Just the generals of fermentation temperature, just to hit on it. And then we'll focus more specifically on lagers. This is generally viewed, as we mentioned at the top of the show, as being one of the most important factors in determining beer character. And I would say many believe that, fermentation temperature control is the sole thing that you need to focus on if you want to make a quality batch of beer. That is, why most of us have some form of fermentation temperature control in our breweries, whether that's a chest freezer or glycol or whatever it might be. Now, like you said earlier, Jordan, the big thing with fermentation temperature, yes, there are yeasts that seem to perform more ideally at within specific temperature ranges. That's great. But the idea really is you don't want it to get too hot. That's the biggest thing that my takeaway from the 2 decades that I've been brewing is, it can get a little too cool. You might get some weird, characteristics because of the too cool, or you might just get a sluggish fermentation. But the real concern is if it gets too warm. For lagers, that means, getting up above over, say, 55 degrees Fahrenheit. You might even differ with me on that one. For obviously for ales, anything over about 72 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 22 degrees C, you run the risk of producing off flavors that you just don't want in that beer.
Right. And so what you're exposing, it's very strain dependent. And there are certain strains that are happier, or at least they produce a beer that we expect it to taste like from historical, kind of conceptualizations around that beer style when you ferment them cold. And then there's others that they work just as well and super clean at that warmer temp. And then, even on the farther end of that spectrum, you get into the Belgian strains where they start to produce some of the esters and phenols that we like a bit above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you can go to the end of the spectrum with Kvike, which makes a reasonably clean beer all the way up to like 100 Fahrenheit. So there's quite the spectrum of temperatures that we can use here, but it's really tends to be yeast strain specific.
Yeah, exactly. Like you said, Kvike, but also, I think the common one that a lot of us who are cutting our teeth on fermentation temperature knowledge back in the day, Saison, right? How many people did you know who are, fermenting Saison at 76 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that? It really is strain dependent. But I think in general, if we're going to focus on lager yeast, the big fear is that if you ferment too warm, first off, you've got this yeast strain that or species of yeast that is able to ferment at cooler temperatures without getting too sluggish. That in and of itself is awesome, right? Like, great. The idea with lagers, though, is that cooler fermentation is going to suppress the development of these compounds that are more associated with ales. So esters in particular, if we're looking at, Belgian styles or French Saison or anything like that, that also includes phenols, which are that spicy characteristic in beer. Esters, again, being the more fruity characteristic. As an aside, I got into a conversation with somebody recently about this idea that how can you tell esters apart from fruity hop character? I'm not sure people can, actually, and I think a part of the reason IPA works so well is that you create this gestalt of whatever very, very slight esters might be in the beer, combining with this crazy fruity thing from the hops. There's no way to tell it apart, but people will still, like on our surveys, they'll still mark esters because they're, presumably perceiving this very, very fruity hop compound. Either way, by fermenting cool, the idea is that you're suppressing the development of that. What is your, I'm asking for your opinion, and this isn't even a Brews Views episode, Jordan, but in your mind, what is like the max temperature, traditionally speaking? We've all fermented lagers at ale temps, whatever. But in your mind, like what's the max temperature you're going to allow your primary fermentation to go through for if you're using a traditional lager yeast?
It depends on the strain. So, some of these German lager strains can go super cold, like 46F.
Yeah.
And then Czech strains, they're, kind of starting about 50F. So I tend to be about that 50F range for German and Czech strains, a little colder for German. But in terms of my ceiling for a traditional lager, I would say probably 52 or 54.
Yeah.
But it really is strain dependent because you mentioned esters, but the other thing here is sulfur. And whether or not tasters can taste the difference, we do know that a colder fermentation means that more sulfur is kept in solution because those warmer fermentations, it blows off. And so the other effect that we have with a colder fermentation is it actually suppresses attenuation a bit. And so with a warmer fermentation with lager yeast, you will attenuate more, which is just another lever that we can play with depending on our desired output.
Well, yeah, and I think it behooves us to talk about diacetyl rest as well. Most lager, you're a traditional lager brewer. I mean, from start to finish, right? You're step mashing often or decoction mashing, and then going fermenting cool and lagering over a period of time. Still, you often perform a diacetyl rest, right?
Right, and I still use ALDC as well in every batch, which is an enzyme that prevents the formation of diacetyl. And so it's just a really good piece of insurance is to warm that fermentation up to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit at the end of fermentation. The last degree Plato, last even half is going to be fine. The big thing with these, if you want to make these traditional lagers that are suppressing the esters, that are keeping a reasonable amount of sulfur in solution, not over attenuating, is starting cold and getting at least the first half of fermentation cold. After that, with the diacetyl rest, you're blowing off the diacetyl and you're finishing, your attenuation. You're not going to get a whole lot of ester production in the second half of fermentation. So that's why we go up a little higher because we've kind of already done what we need to do on the cold side, and now it's time to get rid of the bad stuff.
Well, yeah, and my understanding, and I'm not sure if this comes from Narcissus or if it's just something that Mike McDowell, Tasty, had said at one point. He and I were chatting about this, like these hybridized versions of lager fermentation schedules that he and I both were doing at the time. And basically what you're doing is pitching cool. So you're just like you would a traditional lager, but basically by, 12 to 24 hours in, you start ramping that temperature up gradually over time. The idea being that, or it's based on the premise that most of that those esters are developed in the during the lag phase, which is so meaning that as soon as you start to see active fermentation, in essence, when a Kreuzen starts to form on the top of that beer, you're pretty much safe, and you can ramp it up all the way up to ale temperatures if you want. That was ultimately my stepping stone to just being like, but what would happen if I pitched warm then? Because I was reading about these people who would pitch warm, chill their wort or chill their beer at that point, and then ferment it like a lager and their argument was you don't have to, and here we go. We're going to segue into the next piece of this. You can pitch ale pitch rates if you pitch warm and then chill the wort, because as you're chilling it, it is doing it's propagating itself in that wort just the same way it does with an ale. So to me, I kind of put those together, and that's what ultimately led to me experimenting with, fermenting at ale temps with lager yeast. But let's move into yeast pitch rate, because it is, in my opinion, a function, or the recommendation of how much yeast you should pitch is a function of the temperature that you're fermenting that beer at.
Absolutely. So this is why they often recommend that with your lagers, you pitch about twice the pitch rate of your ales. So if you're looking at like an imperial yeast pack for like a 1045 OG ale, one pack, 200 billion cells is about right. So for a lager, the same OG, you need two of those packs if you want to follow this standard instruction. But that's not a function of the biology of the yeast. It's a function of the temperature at which we're fermenting these at. And so that's really the impetus behind the experiment that we're going to talk about today. Is I'm like, well, if we're fermenting them warm, we probably don't need to double the amount that we're using, because the whole issue of colder temperatures suppressing fermentation rigor, and thus having more yeast in there to just do a more effective job, given that these 50 degree Fahrenheit or so temperatures are kind of tough for yeast. Why not just use an ale amount if we're going to do it the ale temperatures anyway?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And let's just real quickly go over some of the concerns brewers might have about underpitching, which just means you're not pitching enough yeast, or you're not pitching the recommended amount of yeast, or overpitching, meaning that you're just pitching way more. I think the easiest, or perhaps the most commonly talked about form of overpitching, is when brewers rack fresh wort onto an entire yeast cake. It happens all the time. We've all done it. I've done it several times. So underpitching, that's really the big concern. First off, you're going to have increased lag, which on its own is going to increase the risk of contamination taking hold before that yeast gets to work. So if you're not pitching enough yeast, it may not outcompete whatever other bugs might be in there. I have very intentionally, this was pre-Brülosophy, I've talked about this before, I wanted to see what would happen. I kind of was a little bit cynical about all of the pitch rate stuff that I'd learned and been practicing. And so I took this tiny little amount of yeast that I had harvested from a starter, had been sitting in my fridge for 6 months. It was the WLP 029 Kolsch yeast. I thought, I'm just going to pitch that into a fresh batch. It was my very first brew in a bag batch of wort, and I just tossed in this tiny little amount of yeast. And I'm telling you, you would walk out into my garage, and the smell of burnt rubber was it was just crazy. And those are phenols. That is a phenol that is a function of major yeast stress. So yes, that was an extreme example, but there are people out there who would argue that if you're under that 0.75 milliliters, a million cells per milliliter per degree Plato, you can impart that beer with off flavors like that. So that is a big issue with underpitching. Am I missing anything there, Jordan?
The only thing I'd add is this is, again, yeast strain dependent. And so the Belgian strains actually, and Hefeweizen strains, German Hef strains, can actually benefit from a lower pitch rate. So the 0.75 rule of thumb really applies to kind of classic clean ale strains, be it American, Scottish, British, what have you. But with the Belgians and probably the Kveiks, you can go a little lower, because we're intending to stress those out a little bit, where esters, phenols are a goal. But if you want a super clean fermentation, 0.75 is a good rule of thumb.
Oh, without a doubt. And you look at some of the newer, I mean, I say that relative to some of the older labs out there. Imperial, was it Giga Yeast? There's a few other ones that are packaging 200 billion cells per pouch now. They're doing that on purpose, because that is a pitchable amount for the vast majority of regular strength ales, and again, you pitch two of those and you've got your lager pitch rate. So I think that's pretty great. Have you experienced any downsides to over pitching? I'm curious.
Only, I think, when pitching, racking on a cake. I made a short and shoddy, maybe it was a Keller beer that's on the website, that I racked directly onto a cake, and it just ripped through fermentation like in a couple days. Had this kind of yeasty notes, I think maybe some sulfur. I wouldn't recommend it unless you're going from a standard strength beer and then racking a super high gravity beer. That can definitely work, but with standard strength to standard strength, it's just too much yeast.
Yeah, I have some weird, I guess, qualifications for if I'm going to rack onto a yeast cake, just because I've had some bad experiences, though I'm not sure it was because of the pitch rate. I think for me, I did an experiment on kettle trube. So I did one batch that had, no kettle trube at all, and the other batch that had everything from the kettle basically in it, fermented those, and I let that sit for too long. And then I racked a beer onto that yeast cake, and the one with the high trube, and you could taste, to me, it was just this unpleasant kind of yeasty flavor. So I wouldn't do that. But like you said, if you're fermenting a pale ale, a 1055 pale ale, and then you rack like a 1080, double IPA wort onto that yeast cake, I actually think that's a good idea. I've done that several times and it seems to work great. In fact, that was how Tiny Bottom was born. It was my, basically my starter yeast wort. And then I racked a double IPA onto that yeast, and it worked great. So, over pitching, some of the things you'll hear though is that it could lead to a thinner bodied beer. I've not experienced that. Because of how viable that yeast is, you've got so much in there. People say that you get less ester development. If you're hopping it probably doesn't matter in my opinion, but those are really the only downsides to overpitching that I hear about. So let's move on to this kind of interplay between fermentation temperature and yeast pitch rate. We've talked a bit about it already, but again, yeast pitch rate is a function of the temperature at which you're going to ferment that beer for the most part. And that's because there is a positive correlation between yeast activity and temperature, just meaning that cooler temperatures are going to lead yeast to being kind of like us humans. You want to sit inside and huddle up and not work so hard. But when it's warmer out, your muscles are loose, you work harder, you can get more done. And that's the same thing for yeast.
Right. And so in order to get a good fermentation with no off flavors, we need to pitch more yeast or a higher pitch rate in cold fermented lagers to compensate for that cooler temperature that happens during fermentation.
Exactly. So we're going to move to the style here that you focused on in the, it's a perfect style for this type of an experiment, in my opinion, that you focused on in that experiment, which is Munich Helles, which the BJCP describes as a gold-colored German lager with a smooth malty flavor and a soft, dry finish. Subtle, spicy, floral, or herbal hops and restrained bitterness help keep the balance malty but not sweet, which helps make this beer a refreshing, everyday drink. One thing you didn't hear in there was that it's spicy or that it's fruity. It's a very clean, perhaps the cleanest style of pale lager that I can think of, at least. Maybe international pale lagers up there with it. Now, brewing blasphemer that I am, most of the lagers I've brewed over the last decade have been made with ale yeast pitch rates and fermented at ale temperatures. I know that's crazy for a lot of people to hear out there. Jordan, just cover your ears. But thankfully, we have you here, Jordan, plugged into tradition and doing things the right way. I think it's great. You were curious of the impact fermentation temperature has when using proper yeast pitch rates for either batch fermented based on that temperature. And so you designed an experiment to test it out. Those results when we're back from this break.
We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
As far as I can recall, in all past experiments that we've done on fermentation temperature, we've kept the yeast pitch rate constant, meaning that the cool fermented batch received the same amount of yeast as the warm fermented batch. So whether we're comparing Pilsners, pale ales, whatever it is, they both received the same amount of yeast. And shockingly, many of those experiments returned, I would say most of those experiments returned non-significant results. Jordan, you were interested to see or how things might look different if the yeast pitch rate was determined by the fermentation temperature, right?
Exactly. And that was one of my concerns with those prior experiments. It's like, well, maybe the warm fermentation is like an estery mess or whatever, but then you got this problematic fermentation on the lager side as well with a lower pitch rate. And so maybe like two wrongs make an equal or something like that. So I was thinking
cancel each other out or whatever. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So like, why don't we actually brew a lager as one quote should, and then brew an ale, understanding that you don't need as much yeast like modern kind of quote short and shoddy brewers are doing. And let's see if we can taste the difference.
Yeah, perfect. So walk us through your brew day, and tell us some of the reasons why you designed this recipe the way you did.
Sure. So I made 2 5-gallon or 19-liter batches of Munich Helles. And honestly, Marshall, it's been too long. I need to get back in the Helles brew house. I've been doing other types of lagers, a lot of Czech lagers lately. And man, I would love to have a Helles on tap again. And so, this might have been the last Helles I brewed now that I think about it. But I was a big fan a couple years ago of including a dash of Carahel in my all my German lager recipes. So this was 95% Pilsner malt and 5% Carahel. And in theory, that Carahel brings out a little bit of malt sweetness that you might not get without a decoction or something like that. So
right.
I think there's an experiment that we need to tackle someday on Carahel. But for this, no decoction, just step mash. So I did 144F or 62C, then up to 160F or 71C, and then a mash out at 170F or 77C. So once those mashes were complete, I removed those grains from my claw hammer units and boiled for 90 minutes. 70-minute addition of 28 grams or 1 ounce of Hallertau Mittelfrüh. And then at 40 minutes, 43 grams of Hallertau Mittelfrüh. And looking at that schedule, that's clearly a Bierstadt ripoff. That's kind of Ashley Carter at Bierstadt's method, that 70 and 40 minute approach. So I'm clearly riffing on her inspiration here. Once the boil was complete, the worts were chilled and transferred to identical fermenters, and ICFG is identical at 1043. So a little low, but definitely, nothing wrong with a, sessionable Helles.
Not at all. I mean, I'm loving this. And just a couple of things. One, the 90-minute boil. I'm assuming that is primarily, one, you were inspired by Ashley, of course, from Bierstadt Lagerhaus, which is Denver's best brewery, in my opinion. But the 90 minutes, a lot of us look at that and we're like, all right, DMS. We're trying to make sure that there's no DMS in the beer, that extended boil. Are there any other reasons that one might want to boil longer besides DMS?
OG. If I have a lower than efficient mash than I was anticipating, be it like my recipe, just assumptions were wrong or something happened in the water chemistry or recirculation or whatever, I will extend my boil just to concentrate it more. Because if I had only gone 60 minutes, this is probably a 1040 OG beer, and that's just not as high as I was going for. So I am not concerned about DMS. I mean, with short and shoddy, we've clearly demonstrated at the homebrew scale, you can, in the modern malts, that you're not going to have a DMS bomb with a shorter boil. It's really, for me, just a function of wort concentration.
And then the only other thing that I would, why I might perform an extended boil is when you're using hops, pretty much any of the noble hops like Mittelfrüh, they can be so low alpha that some people, are concerned that if you are doing a shorter boil, you're going to have to add so many hops that you could get like a vegetal thing. I have not experienced that as far as I'm aware, at least, but just to cover those bases, that this was, the 90-minute boil here. As much as many people believe still that you do that to eliminate the risk of DMS, that was actually not the reason for you performing the 90-minute boil. I think that's interesting.
So now that we have chilled beer, it's time to introduce the variable. So I chilled one of those worts to 48F or 9C, and I pitched 2 pouches of Imperial Yeast L26 Pilgrimage, maybe my favorite German strain of all time. That is the On-Deck strain, and I really wish that Imperial would bring that back as a seasonal, which was determined to be the proper pitch rate for that 1.5 lager style pitch rate. Whereas the other wort was chilled to 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 Celsius, and I just pitched 1 pouch of that same yeast packaged on the same day, giving us a standard kind of 0.75 ale pitch rate and a standard ale temperature.
Yeah, so if we had designed this, well, we have done many experiments just like this with fermentation temperature, where we didn't adjust the pitch rate for that temperature. And in those ones, what we would do is pitch either 1 pouch into the cool and the warm fermented beers or 2 pouches. For the most part, we were just doing 1. So I remember when you first joined the crew, you and I had been talking about this very factor here long before you performed the experiment, because you were like, but what if? And so this is such a well-designed experiment, in my opinion, that nice, cool, traditional lager got a traditional pitch rate, and that warm fermented blasphemous lager is getting a lower pitch rate because it doesn't need more yeast because it's being fermented warm. Perfect.
Right. And so one thing that you might experience with the warmer fermentation is a faster attenuation time frame. And so I did let these things kind of sit in their fermenters for the same amount of time before they were transferred to lagering kegs. So after 12 days of fermentation, the cool ferment beer was gradually raised to a 62 degree Fahrenheit or 17C diacetyl rest, while that warm fermented beer remained at 66F or 19C. And so about 2 weeks at this point, I took hydrometer readings and see pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
The cool fermentation was 1011 and the warm fermentation was 1010 FG. You know, you've done a lot of these side-by-side experiment beers. Occasionally, you'll see a slight negligible difference like this, even when the variable hasn't been introduced yet, if it's like a cold side variable. But, you know, given that we would expect a warm fermentation to attenuate further, maybe that 1 point was chalked up to that, but it certainly wasn't a dramatic impact on attenuation.
Oh, yeah. And how many times have you fermented a traditional lager, which I have done several times, I'm not, and it attenuates in the way that you would expect an ale or a warmer fermented beer to attenuate. It's not like a consistently predictable thing that's going to happen with the attenuation. And if in case we failed to mention it in the last segment about diacetyl rest, another reason people do this is to encourage attenuation. Now, 62 degrees is a bit lower. I have to imagine you made that decision because you just didn't want it to get up to the same temperature as the warm fermented beer. But 62 degrees is a little bit cooler than what a lot of people will do a lager D rest at, right?
I mean, I think that pro brewers, that's a fairly standard temperature, but I'm sure there are plenty of home brewers that are going closer to 70.
Yeah. Okay, so again, you would think though at 62 degrees, I mean that's 12 degrees give or take warmer than what you were fermenting it at. I would think that that's going to wake that yeast up and get it to finish out. So whether you want to believe that one specific gravity point was a function of the variable or not, I'm not sure it even matters. So.
Right. And who knows if this was a higher OG lager, like closer to 1050, maybe there'd be a couple more points that we'd observed in the difference. But when you're starting at 1043, there's like really not that far down to go anyway. So who knows?
Yeah. No, I'm with you on that one.
So, okay, we've observed the FG difference. So now it's time to get these into CO2 purged kegs and left to lager on gas in my Keyser for 4 weeks. And at that point, they were ready to serve, enjoy, and evaluate.
Okay, so I am looking at the picture of these beers right now. I don't think just based on yeast pitch rate and fermentation temperature that I would expect to see much of a difference, particularly since you lagered them for a month. They look identical to my eyes. Maybe one would expect the cool fermented beer to be a little bit hazier or just because it was cooler. But I'm not seeing that at all. Pale yellow, stark white cap of foam, very clear. It looks like maybe the only thing getting in the way of the bright clarity is some condensation on the glass.
Yep. They looked really good.
All right. And so no differences that we could tell by our eyes at this point. Now, before you went and administered the triangle test to your panel of tasters, you did your own round of what we call semi-blind triangle tests. You know the variable, but you didn't know what beer was in which cups. And you did 5 of those triangle tests. And we do this just because our readers asked us to do it. And so out of those 5 triangle tests, how many times did you accurately identify the unique sample?
I think of all the experiments I've done, this is the one that I want to be significant more than any other.
That might play into why you did so well then, my friend.
Right. And so I hate poorly fermented lagers. I hate off flavors in lager. And so I'm a bit of a snob, I think, when it comes to lager fermentation. I mean, hell, what's the lager strain that you love?
Harvest.
Harvest.
L17.
I do not like the resulting flavor. And I can tell when I'm at a brewery that's used that Augustiner strain, at least what we're brewing with here in America, because Augustiner over there is obviously amazing, but something about it, it's got this weird ester in it that I just don't like. And so maybe I'm a super taster. I don't know, but I got 5 out of 5 right. And I perceive the warm fermented beer as having a bit... some esters, right? And notably, there was less sulfur compared to the cool fermented batch, which scientifically, I guess, would be expected. But the other thing is it's like a bit more sharp. And so I think that's one thing I've really learned, having fermented more beers with other lager strains at this point in the warmer range, is it does not ruin the beer. But it does have, in my opinion, some little level of ester, reduces the sulfur, and has this like kind of like more Pilsner like character. And I don't mean Pilsner malt, I mean Pilsner style, where it's more like, dare I say, gypsum forward, the effect. And whereas when you ferment cold, like in this example, you get this softer beer that's maybe lacking in esters in this case, and also a little wisp of sulfur. And in my opinion, the cooler fermentation is more appropriate for a Helles style because you want this softer beer. But if you want a brighter, sharper, crisper beer, this warmer fermentation approach actually can work really well. And so maybe like a German Pilsner style, it would be totally appropriate. But in my opinion, I was able to get them right consistently. And it was these kind of like fringe differences related to how soft or sharp or how sulfuric or not, and how little bit of ester or not they were.
Yeah, and that's basically what I was going to say, is that we're going to get back to your performance on the triangle test once we talk about the taster results. But Helles is known for being a soft malty beer. I mean, that is what Helles is. Same as you. If you're making I would say like a Czech pale lager, right? Or what we used to call Bo Pils, that is known for having a bit more hop character. That's probably going to cover up any of. I've yet to taste I've not used Pilgrimage yet, but what you're describing in the difference between these two experiment beers, I've not really had that experience yet. So I may just not be a super taster, which is I'm totally accepted. That's probably a good thing for me. But yeah, very interesting that you got every single one of them right. We'll talk a little bit about bias and all of that stuff here in a minute, but let's get into these blind taster results. You served the triangle test to 18 participants, none of whom had any idea what the variable, or in this case, the variables were that you were testing out. Out of those 18, in order for us to say with any amount of confidence that there really does seem to be a meaningful difference caused by these variables, 10 tasters would have had to accurately identify the unique sample in the triangle test in order for us to say that. Out of those 18, how many actually got the triangle test right?
Only 8 or 44%. And unfortunately for me, this was not significant. Now, Marshall, I don't know if you remember this, but you accidentally published the study before I was done collecting data collection. We had swapped. It was like, oh no, it's supposed to be the IPA experiment. You had this production schedule, and you already had it loaded, and it was too late. And we're only too shy, right? But you're going to hate this, but there is a big caveat in my opinion to this one. Is the majority of my tasters typically are homebrewers. Every month I bring an experiment to my homebrew club, and these are super nerds. And as you know, my experiments are not consistently significant. But I do think that there are certain variables that if they're, a lighter difference, a more mild difference, that it helps to be an experienced beer nerd, beer judge, beer brewer. And this was almost entirely lay tasters, because this got published before the week before I went to my homebrew club. And I'm
such a doofus.
It happens, And so we'll have to redo this one with a different strain.
Absolutely.
Like maybe global, we wouldn't tell the difference because that thing is so robust, but
right.
I had a couple brewers in the panel of 18, and when this got published, they're like, what the heck? How did people not get this right? It was so obvious to me. And so this is definitely anecdote, but of the couple brewers in that 18, they were 2 of the 8 that got it right, and they, in their opinion, thought they were night and day. Right. And so it honestly doesn't surprise me that someone that's like, yeah, I've had beer before, isn't like tuning in to like the subtlest differences in sulfur or like ester notes. Who knows if the Homebrew Club would have got it right too? But that was a personal bummer for me that it was a largely lay panel.
Well, let me put it this way. Let's say you had gotten the 20. Okay, and we're going to do a little bit of just hypotheticals here. You had gotten 20 tasters. Only one of the 2 additional tasters would have had to get the triangle test right in order for us to say that, or to cross that threshold of significance, which is 0.05, right? So 10 out of 18 or 11 out of 20. 11 out of 20 gets you to significance. 10 out of 18 doesn't. Now, I'm going to kind of jump off of this. There have been, I think, 2, I can only think of, we've done so many experiments, 2 past fermentation temperature experiments for lagers or using lager yeast that have returned significant results. Those were L17 Harvest from Imperial Yeast, and I believe it is the Grupo Modelo strain. I forget what, Que Bueno from Imperial Yeast. Those 2 yeast, when fermented traditionally cold versus ale temperatures and pitched with the same pitch rate, I'm going to put a pin in that, they returned significant results. So it wouldn't surprise me if Pilgrimage is along that family of less robust yeast strain, lager yeast strains. That would not surprise me. I'm kind of with you. I wish I wasn't a dumbass, and I wish I wouldn't have published this sooner than we did. But I suspect that this could have been significant. Don't get me wrong. That's why we have to redo this. I really like this experiment. Then we have to ask ourselves, though, is that difference because of the fermentation temperature or because of the yeast pitch rate? And where I'm at, just based on what we've done in the past, again, hypothetical, maybe this was significant. We don't ever treat any of our results as like, locked in and
gospel.
Truth of exactly gospel. I'm still of the opinion that the yeast pitch rate probably didn't play that much of a role in this, just because we have those 2 past lager firm temp experiments where the pitch rate was exactly the same, and yet there was still a significant finding.
Well, and I did a pitch rate one where we fermented both cold, and one was pitched with 2 packs and one was 1, and I don't even think I could taste the difference. And I was like,
exactly.
How is this possible? But in the realm of statistics, there is a thing called an interactive effect. And so when you run a regression model, you could have 2 things that are not statistically significant on their own. Let's say we're predicting birth rates in a county or something, and we see that race on its own is not significant, and income on its own is not significant. But when you interact them in the model, sometimes then all of a sudden it is significant, suggesting that it's a given demographic variable on its own doesn't actually predict the outcome, but the interaction between the 2 does. So although we don't have the sample size or the design to run regressions on this, it very well could be that on their own with this strain and this style at this OG, that maybe they wouldn't make as much of a difference, but collectively there is an interactive effect. But who knows?
Yeah, and when we use the term, it's kind of a psychobabble term, but the Gestalt effect, right? This idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? That maybe these 2 things are interacting in some way that have a meaningful impact, but it's you only get that when they're together, right? It's kind of same along the lines of what you're saying there. So I think it's fascinating. Again, this was a non-significant experiment. That doesn't mean you can just write it off, or you could do whatever the hell you want. But we wouldn't recommend that you just write it off as being that this doesn't matter. That is not what we've ever said. It's not what we're saying here. And I do look forward to seeing another experiment down the road. I think it would be really interesting to use one of those strains that we have already done a fermentation temperature experiment on, and it returned a significant result with or maybe a non-significant one. So we would have to use something like Global, I guess, or the Czech lager strain. What do they call that one? Urkel? Imperial Yeast Urkel?
Well, and then recently there was the seasonal Looker, which I've run about 5 fermentations through. I love that strain. That's the Budvar strain. But I do think that there's probably a yeast strain mediation moderation effect here, right? That you're going to see different results of different strains. We have demonstrated time and time again that Global is super robust.
Yeah.
And I'm fermenting my hoppy lagers at like 60 degrees Fahrenheit. I've gone up to like 66 F on some style. And especially for brighter, crisper styles, it honestly works pretty good. But for Helles, And I think especially with Pilgrimage, what I've learned here is that a cooler fermentation with a lager pitch rate gives, in my opinion, a more authentic Helles beer, whereas the warm one, honestly, was kind of like a Kolsch. And
interesting.
It was good.
Sure.
It just didn't strike me as Helles. It struck me as more like, Kolsch. And that's, definitely one way you could even make a Kolsch, right? Is use a lager strain, but ferment it closer to 60 degrees Fahrenheit.
There are several beer nerds out there who have suggested that rather than calling our warm fermented Pilsners and such, that we just call it Kolsch. And I won't do it, but if people can do whatever the hell they want. So
well, we don't live in Cologne anyway, right? So we can't.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you can't call it that anyways, pal. We do have one reader comment I want to get to. This one comes from Lee, who says, a great experiment and a satisfying result. My own interpretation of these results is that if we stick to traditional methods, we're not wasting our time because we who brewed the beer will taste a superior product. However, if we're short on time, we can choose to cut corners and our guests will not reliably notice a difference. So I'm very curious to hear your response to this, Jordan. I just want to get out there first that I'm not sure that's the best way to put it. Again, people can have whatever beliefs and ideas they want. To me, though, I think it's more accurate just to say that if you stick to these traditional methods, you might taste a more superior product. But that could just be regular old bias at work. Like I mentioned before, when we are very well aware of what happened and we have a desire, we have an actual want for the results to be a certain way, our bodies, our brains have a way of getting us what we are looking for. And so again, it may very well be superior to Lee, to you, Jordan. That doesn't mean it's going to be superior to everybody else. So I just wanted to get my opinion out there real quick.
I actually don't disagree fundamentally with their comment, because what does these statistics say? They suggest that the majority of tasters will not be able to tell the difference in a blind trial. But it doesn't mean that those in the minority were wrong and just were lucky guessers. Right. It just means that the majority of humans wouldn't. And again, we talked about the biases associated with my sample on this experiment. So I think that that's right. That what I've seen here is that, it wasn't like people were like, oh my God, and throwing the Kolsch-like one against the wall, And so I think that at this sample size, we've demonstrated that, a lot of people won't be able to tell the difference, even if the brewer or brew nerds can. And both made pretty good beers. And so You've got a couple different ways you can skin the cat. And depending on your setup, your desires, your patience, you've got some options.
Yeah, and again, just to end on this, the fact that this was basically a dual variable experiment, firm temp and pitch rate, we cannot say for sure that if either one of those was the reason that you tasted the difference, or if both of them together did. But that's the beauty of this type of experimentation. It's why we keep coming back and doing this. That does bring us to the end of this episode. Do you have anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up, Jordan?
Please bring back Pilgrimage. I love that strain. I miss it.
We love you, Imperial. Bring back Pilgrimage. I want to try it, so I would love to do that as well. But I'm telling you, like you said, global. I mean, that is such a robust yeast. If you want to get into making lagers and you don't have the ability to cool ferment, or you don't want to build prop starters or spend extra money on 2 pouches of yeast, get some global, fermented at 66 Fahrenheit or 19C, and I think you'll be very impressed with the outcome. All right, don't forget to check out the rad brewing content Martin's creating over at The Brülosophy Show, which you can subscribe to at youtube.com/@TheBrülosophy Show. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on Brülosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to Brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit Patreon.com/Brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.